Howdy folks, welcome back to the Steampunk Desperado Channel. As I record this, it's been a quarter century since the first of the Lord of the Rings movies, The Fellowship of the Ring, was released. This and its sequels, The Two Towers and Return of the King, are in my personal top 10 and among the greatest films ever made. Today, however, we're going to talk about the books. Without the books, the movies would have never been created. And one of the reasons that the movies were so great was that they followed the books so closely. Well before the movies, however, Lord of the Rings was a cultural sensation. The books were published way back in the 1950s, but they really took off during the hippie countercultural era, maybe as an escape from the complicated and messy situation the world was in, and still is, into a simpler world of good versus evil. If you grew up in this era, you will remember how Led Zeppelin did 3 songs based on Tolkien's world: Ramble On, Misty Mountain Hop, and The Battle of Evermore. The Canadian group Rush did one too, a song about Rivendell. I also remember my weekly reader. You remember this, boomers? The little magazine you got as a kid? It had a cartoon of a hobbit on one of the covers. Little short guy with furry feet and a dagger in his belt. Clearly, the books captured the popular imagination well before they were adapted for the big screen or even the animations. So the question of the week is, what makes the Lord of the Rings trilogy so great despite its flaws? Yes, flaws. Like everything else in this world, even this great classic has flaws, and I'm going to talk about them later. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. I am grateful and humbled by the attention my last video received. Though I enjoy doing these, viewers like you are what make the work of writing, recording, and editing this content worthwhile. I actually read Lord of the Rings twice, which is saying something for me because I seldom reread anything. I have a pretty good memory, and also there's always so much else to read. Last time I read Lord of the Rings, it was 20 years ago, and though I recently read some addenda to the Silmarillion, that didn't impress me nearly so much. Though to be fair, that was a collection of J.R.R. Tolkien's writing published posthumously in 1977, edited by his son Christopher. So they really aren't in the same category. The same year, 1977, was also the year that Terry Brooks published the first book in his Sword of Shannara fantasy series. Just last month, I had the impulse to get the audiobook and listen to that, since I'd heard a lot about it. Mainly that it was a ripoff of Tolkien. And I thought, well, I'll be the judge of that. Maybe they're being a little too sensitive. In fact, I was shocked by just how blatant of a ripoff it was. Aside from that, it wasn't a bad story, but it just wasn't as good as Tolkien. Part of the problem was Brooks's style, which I found to be florid and loaded with overwrought and over-emotional verbiage. That's what inspired me to talk about the elegance and simplicity of Tolkien's prose as a counterpoint. But the story itself was also an issue. As the Bible says, there is nothing new under the sun, and that's certainly true of literature as well. If a story were completely original, it would be incomprehensible because we couldn't relate it to our lives. Like Brooks, Tolkien drew from other sources. In his case, it was mainly ancient folklore, great stories like Beowulf and the Norse sagas. And this illustrates the difference between Tolkien and Brooks. Brooks stole from Tolkien, but that's not the primary problem. The problem was that he didn't add anything of value. Tolkien, on the other hand, stole from the anonymous bards of antiquity, but he made the story his own by adding a number of innovations and particular strengths that make Lord of the Rings a classic. As I mulled it over, I thought of 5 particular strengths of the series, which I will detail here. Number 1, technique. If you've ever read an ancient story, such as Beowulf or the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh, You'll find that although they are fascinating, the story itself lacks the careful pacing, the flow and coherence you would experience in a modern novel. Tolkien bridges this gap. He takes the mythic contents of the old stories and applies the techniques of modern writing. The enduring eternal values of heroism and sacrifice remain, but it's more enjoyable. Because early legends were performed for an audience, sung or recited as poetry, the tellers relied on their performance to make it real. There was no time, no opportunity to add in the elements that make it vivid and immersive to a modern reader because that would have just taken too long. You couldn't hear it in one sitting. In Lord of the Rings, by contrast, we get glimpses of the minds of the characters. We see all aspects of this vast, sprawling saga and vivid descriptions, not just summaries. You can see Tolkien's first-hand knowledge and understanding of the old stories, which is something you don't get if the writer's creating something secondhand, like Brooks did. Number 2, modernity. Now, I am not talking about the deconstruction or subversion of expectations like the cynical leftists do. No, I'm talking about making the old legends relevant. A traditional element in stories of adventure and exploration is to start from a point where the readers can understand, often with a modern Englishman or American thrust into a unique or alien situation. For example, in the movie The Last Samurai, it's about Japan, but the hero is an American. Tolkien does this in Lord of the Rings by adding the elements of traditional England, certain elements that people would recognize and relate to. We see this in the lifestyle of the hobbits of the Shire. They like their homes neat and tidy, and they appreciate the things that the English traditionally enjoyed, such as hearty food, tea time, a pint of ale, pipe smoking, and so on. These things don't quite fit with medieval style of the rest of Middle-earth, but they do make it more relatable. Number 3, characters. What do we remember from Lord of the Rings? To some degree, I think of gloomy forests of Mirkwood and the forbidding Mount Doom, but most of all, it's the characters. There's the reluctant hero Frodo, the wise but fallible wizard Gandalf, and the warriors Legolas and Gimli, their unlikely friendship despite their bickering, and the dashing Aragorn. The heroic characters inspire us and at times move us to tears. We see the world through the eyes of the hobbits. Who wouldn't feel small in such a situation with so many vast and intimidating things going on? The antagonists are fascinating as well, not just the evil Sauron and Saruman, but the mad and pathetic Gollum as well. Mrs. Desperado does a hilarious Gollum impression. We hate those hobbitses. I had a friend in high school who was obsessed with Gollum to the point of printing the word Smeagol on a t-shirt and actually wearing it to school. I don't know why, perhaps because as a nerd he identified with Gollum's status as an outcast. In any case, because we relate to the characters, we stick with them. I remember reading it the first time thinking, oh my God, this trek up Mount Doom, this is so difficult. They're having such a hard time. But I kept up with it because I had grown to feel close to Frodo and Sam. Number 4, world building. Unlike the villagers who sat listening to tales of Beowulf, we are not intimately familiar with the mythology of the land. So Tolkien has to provide a complete magical backstory for Middle-earth and weave it into the narrative. There are maps, their histories, genealogies, and so forth. He invented 2 Elvish languages, supposedly based on Welsh and Finnish. Though I've heard it said that he actually wrote the books to showcase these linguistic creations. Whatever, the result was the same. Number 5, humor. Because Lord of the Rings is at times a grim and harrowing tale, it is good to have an occasional touch of laughter because it provides relief from the dark and serious subject matter. There is not as much explicit humor as in the prequel The Hobbit, because that was more of a kid's story anyway. For example, where the dwarves are teasing poor Bilbo that they're going to break all of his precious dishes. No, in Lord of the Rings, the hobbits themselves are the comic relief. They're creatures of habit. They complain about missing their comforts and their 5 meals a day. Gandalf has a very wry sense of humor. Bilbo says, "You're late," and Gandalf says, "A wizard is never late or early. He arrives just when he's supposed to," which is probably true. And then there are the walking trees, which are kind of a funny concept in themselves. All of these things point to Tolkien's motivation in writing The Lord of the Rings. As a rule, we writers have the goal of expressing ourselves first and making money second. This was certainly the case for Tolkien. He stated that since England has no mythology of its own, his goal was to create one. And he certainly succeeded. And in fact, we Americans have adopted it as well. As for Brooks, he made a lot of money from his plagiarism because he came along at a time when there was really no other high fantasy available or being published. But ironically, Tolkien's estate is worth a lot more, probably $500 million to $1 billion. So I've read, and that's not too shabby. As I said, I have read the series twice, including the prequel, The Hobbit, of course. The first time I read it, I was 13. I remember reading it in 7th grade study hall. Now, school was pretty easy for me, so I didn't have anything to study in study hall. I had to read instead. And the books were absolutely magical, but there were a handful of things about them that I did not like, which I'm going to go into now. Surprisingly, however, when I reread them so many years later, I did not change my mind. But I had more of a nuanced view, and so here they are, the faults. The first is immortality. The idea that some races are immortal, or more correctly, ageless, since they can die, it's just not inevitable. It seemed to me that this made the mortal races, the humans and the hobbits, seem kind of insignificant by contrast, hardly worth bothering with by these godlike beings. It also made the genealogical lists in the end of the Return of the King kind of silly. I mean, instead of a whole sequence of dwarf kings, wouldn't you have just one reigning forever? Plus, what would immortality do to your mindset? Larry Niven handled this pretty well in his known space series, where he had this alien race called the Puppeteers. They did not age, and so they became extremely cautious about their personal safety to the point of being psychotically averse to risk. And this doesn't happen in Lord of the Rings. You see these elves march into battle like, well, I'm going to just throw away my immortal life for this cause. I struck me as a little strange. I know I'm overthinking it because it's more of a symbol. Like mortality of humans, I think, is a sign of our fall from grace. And it also makes it more of a sacrifice when Arwen, the elf princess, marries the noble Aragorn. She has to give up her immortality to do so. And still, this kind of bothers my hard sci-fi mindset. Second problem I had was women. Now, it may seem strange for me to say this, since I have railed against mandatory representation in woke science fiction. To clarify, I'm not advocating inserting an anachronistic girl boss, such as the way that Rings of Power portrays Galadriel. No, she is supposed to be wise, angelic, and well above things like battle and warfare. But it seems strange that there aren't more women in supporting roles in The Lord of the Rings because it's such a sprawling epic. And after all, women are 50% of society, right? Even back in the 17th century, Shakespeare's plays, and it certainly was not feminist in any way, but Shakespeare's plays had some really strong roles for women. Maybe it struck me so strongly because it was a time when I was first becoming interested in the fairer sex. And I'm thinking, where are the girls? And as for the dwarves, they didn't seem to have any females at all. How does that work? Well, Terry Pratchett solved that problem in his Discworld series. He said, female dwarves have beards too. You just can't tell them apart. By the way, I still think the stories would be stronger with more women in there, with bigger roles for them. And I think the movies made the right choice giving Arwen a bigger role, especially since Liv Tyler was playing her. I always appreciated seeing Liv. Number 3 and final of my criticisms is religion. I grew up in a church-going family, so my 13-year-old self thought it was really strange that this medieval-like setting, that there seemed to be no religion in Middle-earth. There were no churches or temples, people didn't pray, there was no mention of a god or gods. Later, I learned that Tolkien was a very devout Catholic, which seemed even stranger. But if you go back to the Silmarillion, you learn that there is a one God mentioned in that book. The very subtle references to providence or fate or whatever in Lord of the Rings seem like a deistic philosophy, which suits my current self much better than the theology of, old time Christianity. Still, it struck me as clashing with this quasi-historical setting. Tolkien's choice may have been driven by his time. If he had portrayed this quasi-Christianity in his books more explicitly, some of his readers may have found it blasphemous. I mean, it's not exactly the same as our religions, therefore it must be false. Nowadays, with the decline in religiosity, Christian sci-fi writers have no problem portraying and inventing a pseudo-Christian type religion for their fantasy worlds. After all, would a Christ figure be exactly the same on another planet? Probably not. In any case, these religions are always an interesting part of world building. Now, those three things are pretty minor when you really think about it. My goal in analyzing the flaws of Lord of the Rings is not to pick on Tolkien and not to deconstruct. I'm certainly not one of those lefty scolds who claim that the orcs represent black people. Ludicrous as that is, Tolkien is talking about moral corruption, not about race or superiority or inferiority or anything like that. It has spawned some really hilarious and politically insensitive memes. The silliness aside, Lord of the Rings remains as one of the outstanding literary accomplishments of the English-speaking world. My aim is to show that even under serious and impartial scrutiny, The Lord of the Rings deserves its place in the pantheon of great literature. This has been my show on what makes Lord of the Rings trilogy so great despite its flaws. Hope you liked it. Please comment. I'm always interested in hearing what you think and your viewpoints on all of these issues. A brief announcement. Sometime next month, I will be starting a serialized science fiction story about Navy pilots who fly combat drones with their minds. It's a bit outside what I've written before, so I'm particularly excited about it. I'll share more as time gets closer. For now, this is the Steampunk Desperado saying adios amigos from the Steampunk Desperado Channel. See y'all next time.